thank you everyone for joining us today for today's session, the VoLTE Roaming Journey, how and when to launch VoLTE Roaming. We have a really comprehensive, very insight-packed webinar for you today, so it's fantastic to have you with us wherever you're joining us from around the world. And you can expect over the next 45 minutes, I think, a lot of new insight being shared from the latest research from Kaleido, but also a lot of strategic discussion with the experts that we have with us today, really all designed to help yourselves in the wider context as we look at what should our VoLTE roaming strategy look like as we're encountering changes in our ecosystem, be it from network sunsetting to looking at maximizing, best standard quality of service for our roamers as well. So we look forward to everything we're going to present and engage with you over the next 45 minutes. Let me give some quick introductions. So from my side, my name is John King. I'm the Chief Commercial Officer at Kaleido Intelligence. I will be moderating today's session and the panel time, but we also have some experts with us who will be sharing their views on VoLTE roaming. So we have Krista Wilson from Syniverse with us. We have Luc Lamoureux from Geo, Mihaela Ambrosi from Vodafone Roaming Services, and Nitin Bass from Kaleido Intelligence. Guys, it's a pleasure to have you all with us today. I'm just going to invite you quickly to unmute yourselves and give a quick introduction to your roles within your respective companies. If we work from left to right, as we see the screen here, so Krista, if we start with yourself, and then we'll move to Luke and Mihaela, and last but not least, Nitin.
Sure. Hi, I'm Krista Wilson with Syniverse. I manage our global services team who supports VoLTE, IREG, and TADIG testing. Thank you for having me today.
This is Luc Lamoureux. I'm with Reliance Geo, Director of International Roaming, and I'm happy to be here to talk about VoLTE since this is our bread and butter at Geo. We're a 4G LTE VoLTE only operator, and we're deploying 5 GSA. So looking forward to the session. Thank you, John, for having us.
Hello, everyone. I'm Mihaela Ambrosi. I'm the Head of Technology Operations at Voice and Roaming Services, formerly known as Vodafone Roaming Services. I'm happy to be with you today.
Hi, I'm Nitin Bass. I'm one of the chief analysts here at Kaleido with a research focus on roaming, international travel, and wholesale market strategies. Again, great to share some of our key findings from the latest MNO VoLTE roaming MNO survey, and most importantly, honored to be sharing the space with our fantastic panel today. So thank you.
Fantastic, guys. Thank you so much. Even myself personally, I'm really looking forward to all the discussion and what you're going to be sharing over the next 45 minutes. I'm sure the same goes for the audience as well. So perfect. So with that note, let's move on and let's look at the agenda that we're covering on today's session. And again, the whole purpose of doing these webinars is to share the latest insights that we run from Kaleido's perspective with you. So we'll be taking some time in the first section that will be Nitin, taking you through the latest findings from our VoLTE roaming survey. This is something that we'll share a little bit more details on in terms of who took part in that and the questions asked momentarily. But more so than that, I think we're really keen during today's session to enable some good panel discussion and also trigger and allow you as the audience to be asking your questions as well as we go. VoLTE roaming, as we know, has been a key topic matter in the roaming industry for many years now, and you can easily argue not so important as present as well. So once we've gone through the findings from the survey, then we're going to be looking at discussing what this means, look at some of the implications for operators, looking at some of the core topics to discuss to think about how we optimize our VoLTE roaming strategy. Now, importantly, on the agenda screen, you'll see there's 2 sections of audience Q&A as well. And we really want to hear from you as we go through this webinar. So as we're presenting the insights from the survey, as we're discussing the different questions on the panel, you're going to have triggers. You're going to have questions about the survey findings. You're going to think, what does this mean for me, for my own roaming business unit, for our own strategies? And we want to hear those questions as well. I think in the wider picture of enabling the roaming industry moving forward, it's really critical that we're able to be, I guess, open about the things that we may be struggling with, or the questions that we have on the technical side, so we can address those. So as we're going through these sections, in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, you'll see a chat function. And we want you to be putting your questions to us all as we go through that time. So if you quickly look down to the bottom right-hand corner to the chat function, you simply click on that. And ideally, we would like you to select the recipients of the chat to host some panelists. It should be that by default. If it's not, please set it to that. That way we can all see the questions you're asking, and we can have time to look at them at the audience Q&A sections. Okay, so, but as always, the golden rule is, if there's a question that you're thinking, then it's very likely that somebody else on this webinar is thinking of it as well. And we have over 300 of you registered for today's event, all from Roman business units within the operator community worldwide. So I'm sure there's many similar challenges that we're facing in our business roles. So in a moment, I'm going to hand over to Nitin, and Nitin's going to lead us through the first section of this webinar, looking at the survey findings. But to start, let's give a bit of an overview just about the actual survey that Kaleido's conducted. And of course, if you're not familiar, the work that Kaleido does anyway. So most of you will be au fait with us. In fact, I see many of you today with us who took the survey, which is fantastic to see. So as you know, Kaleido is a research house, and we're dedicated to the Roman sector. So 5 days a week, 52 weeks a year, we are researching different topics within the industry, be it from today's topic, VoLTE Roman, to adjacent but related areas such as billing or 5G roaming, analytics, quality of service, you name it. And all of our studies, we like to underpin with the views from yourselves in the industry. So the VoLTE roaming survey, one that we concluded just last month in May, we're essentially asking a series of questions to you, not just to understand, the current status of the industry in terms of, VoLTE roaming launches, but also the challenges, the pain points, how you're looking at this strategically as well. And that's all to help understand and inform us moving forward about how we can optimize and make, I guess, the most efficient industry moving forward. Yeah, and as you can see, a good spread of participants across the globe. Nitin will delve into more detail in a sec about the specific questions we were asking, and of course, key findings. So I think that's a really good note to hand over. So Nitin, I'm going to hand over to yourself now to take us through some of the key survey findings.
Great. Thanks again, John. Hello again. Not many slides, just a few takeaways, and we will get straight to the panel discussion. It's not every day we get all these experts together on a panel. So as John mentioned, the white paper will have a lot more findings, a lot more content and analysis. But if you're an operator who took part in the survey, of course, you will get the full survey analysis and findings from Kaleido. If you're not one, let me take this opportunity to invite you to join our survey panel and reach out to us post this webinar, and we can provide you with access to lots of free industry surveys and findings that we conduct over the year. So firstly, moving on to our first slide. So what we're seeing now is mobile operators around the world upgrading their networks, transitioning to 5G. And what's interesting, or what's exciting to see, is VoLTE is becoming the fundamental component of their roaming services. Finally, over the last 12 to 18 months, we've seen increasing investments in VoLTE, increasing investments going into their IMS services. More and more operators launching VoLTE roaming services. And in fact, as of May 2023, I think there were 238 VoLTE networks, domestic networks, with an additional 300 operators expected to invest in VoLTE. Now, VoLTE connections will be used by over 70% of total SIM connections by 2025. This is according to our latest estimates. Now, from the survey, around 32% of the operators who took part confirmed that they have an existing IMS core, with an additional 32% continuing to invest in IMS core networks. Now, that kind of paints a picture for the readiness in terms of launching VoLTE roaming. But one thing to notice here is that around 19% of the operators who took part had no immediate plans to invest in IMS cores, invest in IMS services. While We believe that this can be attributed primarily to upfront costs in network investments required. One thing that mobile operators must keep in mind is the long-term benefits, not just in terms of service innovation, but also the user experience and other benefits that can be realized while transitioning to 5G. Now, moving on, importance of VoLTE roaming has been widely acknowledged. We've been discussing VoLTE roaming for quite some time now, and the adoption of the technology has been relatively slow. We all pretty much understand the factors that have contributed to this situation, be it the technical challenges, be the interoperability complexities. We understand this well now. But as operators continue to invest in their network infrastructure, engage in those collaborative efforts, what we are seeing is the outlook for VoLTE roaming, especially in 2023, is very promising. And the chart to the left of your screen kind of suggests that. And VoLTE roaming has gained significant importance over the last couple of years. You can see that 81% indicates an increased level of priority compared to previous years, and you can see that 50% now transition VoLTE roaming into a key operational priority for the roaming business unit. So this kind of paints a positive trend within the industry. Mobile operators are increasingly recognizing the significance of VoLTE roaming, and this is pretty much evident across the surveys, across the mobile operator surveys that we conduct over the year. So it's good to see operators actively prioritizing it, and this could be attributed to several key factors. Be it the continued demand for international voice services. We've seen roaming traffic decline, or voice usage decline, but we saw a continued demand for international voice services during the pandemic. We're seeing the closure of legacy networks across major markets. We see mobile operators continuing, not just from developed markets, but also from emerging markets, announcing dates for shutting down their networks, 2G and 3G networks. And finally, it could also be attributed to the need to offer a consistent roaming experience to subscribers. So, as you can see from the chart on your right, operators deploy VoLTE roaming for a variety of reasons, but the sunset plans for 2G and 3G networks, the impending shutdown of 2G and 3G networks, was found to be the primary reason for deploying VoLTE roaming. I think you can see 64% suggesting the same. Quickly moving on to the next slide, let's look at the launch plans for VoLTE roaming across the world. As John mentioned, we interviewed, or we surveyed 100 plus mobile operators, 114 to be precise. Majority of the participating operators have optimistic expectations for the implementation of VoLTE roaming agreements, and that's kind of in line with what we are seeing in the industry. In fact, as you can see from the charts, by the end of 2024, nearly all, not nearly, but all operators will have some form of VoLTE roaming agreements in place. And just to give you an indication on what this was in our 2022 survey, I think a similar number was 80% of mobile operators who took part. Again, that was well over 100 operators that took part in our 2022 survey. Around 80% of those operators indicated the same by the end of 2024. So VoLTE roaming is becoming, or has become, a key topic, which is one of the reasons why we're having these webinars and discussions. But what this survey highlights is the continued commitment to collaboration between operators, to the cooperation between the operators, and we see a lot more operators expecting to establish bilateral VoLTE roaming agreements around the same time frame, as you can see. Moving on to the next slide. And as I mentioned earlier, there are a lot of operators now, not just from developed markets, but also emerging markets, announcing shutdowns or having shut down their 2G and 3G networks. And if you look at the latest numbers, if you look at the first half of this year, around 114 mobile operators have either shut down or officially announced plans to shut down their 2G networks. Now, if you look at 3G, a larger number of mobile operators, I think it's 138 mobile operators have either shut down or announced specific dates for shutting down their 3G networks. Now, this kind of indicates a notable shift within the industry, as operators prioritize this transition away from the legacy technologies to 5G and 5G standalone and so on. It's interesting to see how they ranked the key factors that's driving this. And as I mentioned earlier on, a majority of the respondents once again agree or strongly agreed that the global sunsetting of 2G, 3G networks is what is actually driving their VoLTE roaming strategies and rollouts, quite understandably. Now, what this means for the industry as a whole is and what Kaleido would like to emphasize is the need for mobile operators around the world to conduct comprehensive evaluation of their roadmap, of their technology rollouts, their sunset plans. It's essential for operators to ensure that roaming services are not interrupted in any way due to the sunsetting. At the same time, there's a need to maintain profitability and roaming footprint and revenue. So as you can see, 58% of the respondents agree or strongly agree that there is an increased emphasis being placed on launching domestic services, which is also having an impact on their VoLTE roaming prioritization. So multiple factors contributing to this growth in VoLTE roaming. And as we predicted last time, VoLTE roaming is indeed taking off during this period, between 2022 to 2024. And I've got one more slide. As I mentioned earlier on at the start of this webinar, we conduct multiple operator surveys. And one thing that keeps coming up on operators, strategic directives, their roadmap, their planning is VoLTE roaming testing. It's one of the most important technical requirements from a roaming perspective, as noted by mobile operators across the surveys that we conducted in 2023. Now, it is an essential process. We all understand roaming testing. VoLTE roaming testing is an essential process for ensuring the interoperability and the compatibility of VoLTE services between be it different networks, be it different operators, and there are several challenges that's involved, even when it comes to testing. Be it IMS core network testing, or be it the device testing, or be it an end-to-end testing happening in a lab or in a live network setting. So there's a need to make sure all these tests are carried out in compliance with the relevant standards. And the chart you can see now shows some of the challenges operators face from a testing perspective. The most important one, where you can see 41% reported challenges in defining and validating the various scenarios for VoLTE roaming testing. So, this could be handover scenarios or interworking scenarios, also testing and validation based on quality of service requirements. So you most definitely need to address these testing issues or challenges. And I think we've, in our panel session, we will most definitely touch upon this and discuss this further. But for now, let me wrap this up. And I mentioned more findings and analysis are included in the white paper, so you will be provided with the same after the webinar. But for now, I'll hand it back to you, John. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And already there's a lot of findings that sets us up quite nicely to discuss further. And on the note of the white paper, just important for us to note that as well. So if you are with us today and indeed registered for this webinar, then you will be getting a link from us over email, either come in later today or tomorrow morning, where you can download the white paper, that has further findings from the survey that we've conducted, the results of which you'll see in here, alongside additional analysis from Kaleido's ongoing research. So that'll be a fantastic tool for you to continue informing your strategy. And keep an eye on your inbox, because that will be coming your way shortly after this webinar. But for now, let us move into the first panel section. and there's a lot that we have to discuss here. So first and foremost, actually, I think the survey that we did, and Nitin, this is going to come to you, so stay with me. The survey that we did, there were a lot of different questions that we asked the operators. You've summarized some of the main trends and findings that we see there and what that means for the industry. But I just want to go back to you to say, what would you describe as the major call-outs, the major highlights from the survey that we ran? What are the, if you had to identify those top messages for the industry?
Yeah, so I think to summarize or just call out the biggest takeaways, I think it was it would be how VoLTE roaming is being prioritized, right? The outlook for VoLTE roaming in 2023 is very promising. It actually aligns with the promising growth and recovery of roaming services that's happening now in a post-pandemic world, and it continues to be crucial requirements, and it will play. We understand that it will now play an important role going forward as well. So what is interesting from the survey, at least, was how operators must focus on expanding their network infrastructure. Invest in the IMS core, sign multiple roaming agreements. Looking ahead, I would say the successful launch of VoLTE roaming will propel 5G standalone roaming adoption. I think we will see early sets of 5G standalone roaming agreements later this year, towards the end of this year. But one thing that stood out was, we've seen progress being made in VoLTE roaming agreements. We see all operators saying they will launch some form of VoLTE roaming agreement, VoLTE roaming by the end of 2024. But what continues to be an issue is the lack of comprehensive global coverage. From the survey, we saw most operators have less than 10 bilateral agreements in place, and it's a non-fact that will take several years, and it's a gradual process. It will take several years to establish that scale. So that's limiting the availability of VoLTE roaming. So operators are optimistic about the future, but this remains a challenge going forward.
Yeah, I would agree with those points. I'm keen to bring in Krista, your view from this perspective as well, because obviously you're working at Cineverse, you're working with a lot of operators, across the world, helping them, as they're launching VoLTE roaming. So is what Nitin shared, is that something that you agree or disagree with those findings, and feel free to, counter what we've said if you're seeing different from your conversations?
No, I mean, I agree with these findings. I have several conversations with operators globally. These results reflect the verbal feedback I've also received. VoLTE may not have been a priority for them, last year, but I mean, obviously one of the main drivers of the 2 and 3G shutdown is having the customers look and change their priorities and beginning to start launching VoLTE. So nope, agree with the findings.
Well, we like to hear that as well. And you know what? Actually, the next question I really want to pick up on one of those key findings, and you've already referred to it, Nitin. 96%, right? 96% of the respondents said they were prioritizing VoLTE roaming, and that's, on the one hand, that's fantastic to hear, because as we said at the outset, VoLTE roaming, as we know, if you're listening to this webinar and you're in the roaming industry, you know that VoLTE roaming's been, people have been pushing it for a long time now, many years. It's really encouraging to hear that it is at the top for many people of their roaming, their priority list internally. So that's really encouraging in how we're moving forward as an industry. However, of course, there's still more to be done. And I guess the question, and I'm going to bring this, Luke, to yourself, and then Mahela, I'm really keen to get your views as well, is if we're thinking about how we see that evolving through the remainder of this year in 2023, maybe looking even further afield into next year as well, how can we be helping operators, or to continue to prioritize VoLTE roaming in their operational strategies? So Luke, I'll hand over to yourself first on that.
Thank you. Yes, VoLTE is important, and when we attend WAS and we negotiate with our partners, we sometimes hear, oh, we're going to be looking at 5G. It's also going to be voice over IMS, so it's very, very similar to VoLTE. So whatever is happening right now in VoLTE is future-proof for the next upcoming years as well. There's a lot of questions about VoLTE, and one of the thing I noticed from the numbers is that there's a disparity between the inbound, the outbound. So there's some reasons for that. It's more difficult maybe to launch for inbound on our side than to launch outbound. We've been happy to help and evangelize how to do VoLTE roaming, so we can be reached at any time. And I'm glad you're having this panel today. Hopefully, it helps a lot of operators. If I can just add one quick thing is that we have seen recently that some operators are launching VoLTE on their IMS for roaming, but the SMS over IP are not yet implemented, and it's a great thing to do as well to prioritize for operators. If you launch VoLTE roaming, to do your SMS over IP as well, because certain operators like Geo, we don't support the old SMS ways to deliver SMS, and our partners wants to keep sending SMS welcome. All these types of SMS are very important for the roaming industry as well. So that will be my takeaway here, John.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really important point that often, like you say, can be missed out when we're talking about VoLTE roaming and focusing on the voice and what needs to happen there. Like you said, it's important to remember the SMS side as well. So, no, absolutely. And Mihaela, really, I guess, keen to hear your take on this as well.
Yeah, I think that the percentage look promising. So 96% of operators prioritizing VoLTE roaming is very good news. However, I believe there is still lots to do, as the number of MNOs which have deployed VoLTE roaming or that have plans to deploy VoLTE roaming is still low. And we were discussing about number of roaming relations and so on. For people who are looking for an advice from other companies which launch already VoLTE roaming, the main one is to not discourage if the business case is negative. It's just a voice service over new technology is true, and yes, the customers can make voice calls using applications, but in the absence of VoLTE in the countries without 2G and 3G, your customers may also lose data services, so they're not going to be able to use applications. They are not going to be able to make emergency calls, and those which are normally using voice services abroad may never come back and use regular voice services if they find that the applications are good enough. So that would be my advice for those looking for an advice in this forum, and I'm glad that you guys are organizing this type of webinars to help other MNOs to prioritize and to prioritize VoLTE roaming.
Appreciate that, Mihaela, and I think you're completely right as well. It's increasingly fundamental, right? It's when we think about the network shutdowns as well, and ensuring that quality of service, or indeed any service, sometimes when you're going to be roaming. But actually, your response it takes us very nicely into the next point, actually. And Christo, I'm going to bring this one to yourself, if that's okay. So, thinking here about the best practices for establishing and managing as well VoLTE roaming agreements. Now, when we looked at the survey and the responses from that survey, and we were asking people their expectations for VoLTE roaming agreements, and I think it was somewhere between 10 to 50 agreements was the target for 3 years' time. I think it's great to get those responses back on survey. It's also good to think, okay, what's realistically possible, and how can we help operators around the world to scale quickly their number of agreements and manage them effectively? And I guess I'm really keen to hear just your take on that, on how we can enable operators in that way.
Working with a couple of different operators with different how they've managed their agreements. Some have used their existing agreements that they already have in place with the operators. Some have also they want to have new agreements. Obviously, I would think using your existing and adding an addendum would be a quicker way to facilitate. However, both models can be, supported. One customer, they had over 100, I think, bilateral partners already working with. So they used established agreements, which obviously then is able to move quickly. Negotiations and having resources to facilitate the agreements management could cause delays. I think the 10 to 50 targets is a very reasonable number to achieve. Based off of my experience in working with operators, I think it may not be aggressive enough. So I think there are solutions out there that could help speed this up and work with the operators to get more agreements in place and begin their VoLTE bilateral testing.
Yeah, Absolutely. No, thank you for that. And I think again that it kind of links to a question that we get. So there's a question that we get at Kaleido fairly often in the conversations that we're having with operators, and that's around how are they managing or planning to manage their VoLTE roaming agreements. And again, I think from the survey, and actually Nitin, if you don't mind, I'm going to bring you back in here because again, there were some interesting findings from the survey specifically around this. Maybe you can just give a quick refresh for us on those.
Yeah, so I do agree with some interesting findings from the survey, and into how operators are currently managing or planning to manage their VoLTE roaming agreements. I think it was somewhere between 40 to 45% of the respondents who mentioned they are opting to introduce amendments to their existing roaming agreements in order to incorporate VoLTE roaming. But I think there was around 25% of respondents who said that they want to make VoLTE roaming a mandatory criterion when negotiating new agreements. We also had some suggestions around adding the VoLTE roaming reference information in the IR21 document as a mandatory field again. Yeah, I think the best way forward is something that the operators must investigate, and I think Luke and Mihaela is in a better position to provide a bit more clarity on this.
Yeah, precisely, which is exactly where we're going. So Luke and Mihaela, I'm going to bring this back to yourself. So, we've got a few options. We can make changes to existing agreements. We can make brand new agreements. We can make references to the need for this in the IR21 documents, or we can just make it mandatory in agreements. The VoLTE roaming needs to be there. A lot of different approaches. Is it too simplistic to say which one's the right approach? I don't know. So I'm really keen. Again, you're the guys you're making these agreements. So Luke, let's go to yourself first, and then Mihaela to yourself. I'm really keen to know what are your thoughts on this. What should we be doing as operators to enable this?
Yes, on the roaming VoLTE side, there's an annex to the existing agreement, which is the C14 of the AA13. So that C14 annex will just say which APN you're using and if you can use call type level 2 in TAP and things like that. There was some discussions at the working group of the GSMA 2 weeks ago because, for example, a section is called the architecture, and some members were questioning. We used to have two-way to connect for VoLTE. There was LBO and S8 home routed. Now that LBO is completely out, it's only S8 home routed. So there's a change request to make it a little simpler for commercials to understand and make sure we can fill this out. This is coming up, and by the way, I've received some questionnaire by partners that are still mentioning LBO, SRVCC. So just look at the GSMA new website and make sure you get the new templates. So we're going to be up to date. Just to touch quickly on the IR21, it's mentioned. There's two different sections on the IR21 for VoLTE. So you've got to put your own VoLTE information, but there's also a VoLTE section now in the IR21 where you can declare your VoLTE readiness, and there's also a question about the encryption for lawful intercept. So I encourage the operators that want to launch VoLTE to look at that, because that VoLTE section is more commercially declaring that you're ready for VoLTE and not necessarily just technical items. So make sure that on the commercial side, you review it with your technical people when filling out the IR21. I'll hand it over to Mihaela to complement.
Yeah, I don't know what is the right approach. I can share what was our experience when we launched VoLTE. We decided to use that annex that Luke mentioned, the GSMA annex, that is quite good. And because it's covering aspects such as lawful intercept or quality of service that you may want to enforce in the agreement, in that annex. So you only need to fill that annex according to your requirements. And here I would suggest you to involve legal and security teams when discussing the encryption aspects that you want to put in the annex. Of course, from the technology perspective, maintaining IR21 up to date is critical. Having the right information in that technical document and sharing timely is very important if you want your service to work properly.
Yeah, absolutely. And we know as well that that's, like you say, such a key resource to have as well. So it's important that, like you say, it's, yeah.
Maybe just to mention that at the beginning is going to be very time consuming. So for the contract management, is going to be very intense to come to a version of your VoLTE Annex that is acceptable. But that is just, like in anything we do at the beginning is more difficult, and then it's going to get better. So again, don't get discouraged if it's complicated. It's going to be easier later.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. No, thank you guys. So I think there's one more question that I want to go through now, and then we're going to address a couple of the audience questions that have been coming in. So this is more than looking at some of the challenges and opportunities in implementing VoLTE roaming. And one of the topics that the white paper that you'll receive investigates is around testing. Now, when we look into launch and VoLTE roaming testing, there's clear needs for it, because this is, on the one hand, it's a new process that we're putting in place, and there's lots of bugs that you might counter, so we need good testing. On the other hand, I think there are concerns that's come from our research, from the operators, that sometimes it can be seen as complex, or of course there's another costing element to it, and already VoLTE roaming can be a cost, and then there's testing, which is another cost. So it would be really interesting to look at this whole aspect of testing, and but also the, I guess the challenges, but the opportunity and the need that comes with it as well. I know, Krista, that you've got a couple of slides that will show on this as well, but Luke, I just keen to get your view on this before we come to Krista, just about the reality from your perspective on VoLTE roaming deployment challenges. What needs to be prioritized in your view?
Yeah, if we look at the testing itself, I was a little bit surprised of the 41% in Niteen's answer about the IREG and tagging and testing on its own. There's something that's very different in VoLTE that we didn't have in 2G, 3G, is when you establish a voice call, the signaling used to not be shown in TAP. And when you move to VoLTE, there's some SIP signaling that are exchanged, and it comes out as a record with the QCI5. And that session can be a very, very long session. So I've seen some cases in testing, for example, that someone will start testing at noon, and the SIP signaling session goes until 9 p.m. and you have multiple calls in between. So one of the good things to help testing is just make sure you detach from the network and reattach between each call. That might help on the testing side. One thing that we've seen lately with our partners testing VoLTE is that the integration on their side, VoLTE roaming, was functional and working, but they still had to do some integration on their own billing system, because instead of waiting for the TAP file and the voice information in it, now the voice is handled at home in your IMS and your telephony application server. So that part needs to be integrated too with your retail billing system. So that's some of the things we've seen on our side as well. So I'm going to just comment here on those practical test cases. And I think on the priority and the way to test, we can hear from Krista.
Perfect. Yeah. So Krista, let me move on to then the slides from your end. Just looking at that need to have the, I guess, a defined and functional testing strategy. I'll hand over to yourself.
Sure, thanks. I'm going to go to the next slide. So what we found, is defining that target list and just the coordination and engaging with those roaming partners and getting prioritization in their testing queue. One thing that we realized when some operators announced 2 and 3G shutdown, those testing queues became a very big priority, and customers wanting to get prioritized so they could begin the VoLTE testing and to the launch. And this would be applicable for all testing scenarios, not just with VoLTE. Specific to the VoLTE roaming partner, you can utilize the network closure list that's published by the GSMA member gateway to define their targets. And then once those are defined, then again, we start the engagement with the partners. And when I say Centerverse, VoLTE testing, we do this, we're at like the customers, we're doing this on their behalf. So we've been able to identify a lot of the pain points for the operators because of conducting these tests. And as Luke mentioned, being able to train and work, like if you're the VPMN, help the HPMN on what some of the changes they need to do on their side, because there are some differences on the IR25 where some of these operators, it's new to them compared to more common tests with the IR24 for voice or IR38 for the LTE. We've been successful with accelerating launches because of our global reach and our experience with VoLTE testing. So, you know, again, just working with these operators and the more VoLTE tests that they perform, they're gonna get experienced, and things are gonna they're gonna go quicker. So we've been able to successfully launch now. Again, I know it's been said before, don't get scared, the testing's a test, but now our testing average into a launch is about 2 weeks. When we first began this journey, it was definitely not 2 weeks. We know working with certain operators globally, they may not have the resources and or bandwidth to start this. So some tests were taking upwards to maybe 3 to 4 months, but this has definitely become much more streamlined. So, I mean, average of 2 weeks from the testing to launch is a great number to achieve. And I think the communication between the partners key, and being able to follow up on that life cycle of the test being administered. So it's definitely always, you know, being engaged and having that troubleshooting or the capabilities as well. That's definitely been able to help accelerate, just be able to do the coaching with the operators to tell them what is needed on their side.
I think that's really useful to know as well. And I would imagine for many operators, this is a tangible process that they go through as they're starting to launch their VoLTE roaming. You know, it's something that beforehand, you only realize it, I guess, when you're going through the process. I'd imagine. So, yeah, thank you so much for that. And actually, it ties really nicely into a question that we've had, and I'm of course mindful of the time. The good thing about these webinars is there's loads of good discussion, which I hope you as the audience are finding really insightful. And I can see some of the questions coming through from Roberto and Carla and Michael. I'm going to try and get to those, certainly. I am mindful of the time, but Krista, what you just shared actually ties in quite nicely to the question that Roberto asked. And it was all about, how do you ensure good quality of service elements for VoLTE roaming? This is an important requirement for us. I would imagine that's a similar question for a lot of operators. So maybe that's something that, again, you can share your views on from what you've experienced working with operators.
So is the question around quality, the quality of service?
So the question was, how do you ensure a good quality of service elements for VoLTE roaming?
I mean, well, the test, I mean, itself, I mean, from the completion, from when we started, I mean, to the launch, I mean, that is what we're doing, is the quality of, assurance test, and then coming back, the quality of service to make sure that it's still intact. You do have operators that want to have their specific, like maybe top 5, where they want to continue the quality of service testing to make sure that everything is still working. So that's something that customers do ask, and the operators, and we are supporting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, look, if I bring it in from your perspective as well, I mean, is there anything that you'd want to add to that, just from your perspective, Gio?
On our side, sorry, what we've experienced with our customers roaming on VoLTE is that the quality is very good on the voice side. There's actually some comments were that it's even better than when it was on 2G or 3G circuits, which we could use a least cost routing, ILD route. And so by bringing things at home, it keeps it easy for the customer that's going to be dialing the same thing as he's dialing at home, because everything is handled by the home IMS. And the quality of the voice has been great, and we don't have too many complaints on that point on our side.
Perfect. No, and I think it ties into that whole narrative of quality of service, for an overall roaming strategy, and the importance of it there. So no, thank you guys for that. Okay, Michael and Carla, we're going to get to your questions as well, but I just want to quickly, before that, there's another section of the panel that we really want to get through in the remaining time, before we have our next meetings on the hour. So let's quickly move into that now. And the first one, and Nitin, I'll bring this to yourself as well. So we're looking at the lessons learned from the survey, from the analysis that we did. What does this mean strategically for an operator in their roaming business units as they are planning VoLTE roaming? So what strategies, must operators plan to adopt for supporting voice calls after the, sunsetting of 2G and 3G in key destinations? I mean, can you give some views here?
Yeah, I think could touched on it earlier as well, that it's one of the primary drivers for accelerating VoLTE roaming services, the shutdowns that's taking place and the announcements that's coming over. So what's happening is you expect, on one hand, you expect a gradual expansion of agreements over several years. But on the other hand, you have operators who are yet to establish VoLTE roaming agreements in markets where network shutdowns are taking place or are expected to happen. So from the survey, it was pretty much clear that there are multiple ways that the operators will approach this in order to expedite the establishment of VoLTE roaming agreements. One being relying on VoLTE roaming hubs. In fact, a majority, I think 45 to 50%, indicated that they plan to rely on VoLTE roaming hubs. Alternatively, to ensure continuity in voice roaming services, I think there was a proportion of mobile operators who can actually turn to interworking solutions offered by their roaming partners from an inbound and outbound perspective. This has emerged as a key requirement for mobile operators for the last 2 years. In 2022, when we did the survey, there was a significant proportion of respondents expressing their interest in implementing interworking solutions. Although I must add to it that in 2023, in our latest survey, that proportion kind of declined. But having said that, it presents operators with an opportunity to cater to those non-compatible roamers and facilitate all those requirements, be it lawful interception, be it emergency calling services, wherever the support is lacking, it gives them an alternative to ensure that continuity in voice roaming services.
Thank you for that. And Chris, if I put it to you to discuss, what would your recommendations be, for how to support, how to approach the whole sunsetting and VoLTE, roaming strategies, conundrum? So what can be done to accelerate this? We still see some operators still launching their 4G, roaming, for instance. So I'm keen to get your thoughts on that.
Some of you may know, Cineverse, we developed a solution, Evolve Mobility, which allows interworking between the operators, various levels of implementing and supporting VoLTE, essentially becoming the home operator. So set up scenarios where Evolve Mobility makes it as if the home operator has VoLTE in its own IMS core, removing the need for circuit switch fallback to establish voice and the data services. This core ability in place by a visited operator and MNO has not yet implemented VoLTE roaming, can now support their subscribers as they roam into a visited network that has retired 3G. In addition, Evolve Mobility allows an operator who has retired the 3G to also support their own subscribers as they roam outbound to a visited operator who does not support VoLTE roaming.
Perfect. Thank you for that. Mindful of the time, we've got 2 more panel session questions to get through, and then we'll address some of the wider audience questions. So we have plenty of time. So firstly, I'd like to focus in now on the billing area. Okay, so it can sometimes be perceived as some confusion or better understanding when we look at charging models for VoLTE roaming. So simply put, what is the best plan that operators should have to be billing their customers on this? Again, Mihaela and Luke, I'm really keen to get your views on this. So Mihaela, maybe starting from your end.
Yeah, so first of all, we need to make a distinction between the protocol and the charging model. In terms of protocol, both TAP and BCE can be used as pretty billing protocols with more flexibility to implement new charging models when using BCE. In terms of charging model, the easiest one to implement is the one based on APN and the megabytes of data. So charging information that all operators in the world, I suppose, support. When using QCI, of course, we can differentiate between signaling and media, but the signaling is not that significant to justify the effort to implement a charging model based on QCI. Eventually, the model that is based on APN, megabytes, and QCI will become the charging model, but you can start with the simplest one that is based on APN and megabytes to avoid
I
complexity in terms of billing.
think that distinction and the recommendations within each, I think, are very appropriate to people as well. And we could do a whole other webinar talking about ECE and the opportunities and general industry progression there. But keeping it to this, I mean, Luke, I'm just passing it to yourself because I'm really keen to get your thoughts on this as well. If there's, I guess, anything you'd like to add on top of what Mihaela shared.
On a high level, BCE will support VoLTE, but what we're doing today and what we're seeing in the industry is that TAP 312 is the primary method to charge wholesale for the VoLTE. It's possible to do VoLTE in TAP 311, although if you're on that older version of TAP, you won't have the values for the QCI that are only appearing in TAP 3.12. In TAP 3.12, the call type level 2 field will show you if you're using QCI 1 or 5 or 9, and the APN will tell you if it's IMS APN for voice or SMS over IP, or if it's just a data APN. I know that on our side, we prefer simplicity, and VoLTE, we like to have it as data like everything else, since it's a data service, so keep it simple. And we have some partners that are wondering if they should differentiate charging, so it makes things complicated and there's not a lot of difference at the end. So we promote using VoLTE as data for charging, and the current best way to do it is TAP 3.12, although it's supported in 11, and it's also supported in BCE.
See that likely to remain the norm for the coming years, just from your perspective as well, and just what you perceive in the industry?
Yeah, so on our side, what we see is don't fix something that's not broken. So if VoLTE existing in TAP 312, the things are just frozen in TAP 312, nothing is going to come. So 5GS and everything else is coming to BCE, but I can see it still being there until everything moves to eventually to a BCE standard between partners.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I said earlier, we could have a whole different session talking about this topic, but we'll remain to the point for now. So guys, thank you so much for that. I think there's a final question that I'd like to ask to each of you. So this whole title of this session is described as, the VoLTE roaming journey. Yeah, how and when to launch VoLTE roaming. So from your experience, from the conversations you have in the industry, from what from the work you're conducting on a day-to-day basis in the industry, are there specific pain points that you think operators should be mindful of whilst launching VoLTE roaming? What are the main messages that you would like to convey? So I'd love to give each of you, a minute or two just to share what those main messages are. Luke, as we're chatting already, why don't we start with yourself, and then Mihaela will come to you, and then Krista, finish with yourself, if that works.
Yes, thank you. So one of the things that we see right now, the pain points still existing in launching VoLTE are especially to launch inbound on us. One of them is we need the encryption to be removed for lawful intercept. And mostly we saw from Nitin's answer that many operators are launching IMS services at home first. And there's no really difference at home if you do encryption or not encryption. But when it comes time to roam, to be able to roam and have lawful intercept working, the encryption needs to be off. As we mentioned earlier, there's a place also in the R21 to mention if you require it or not on the VPMN side. The other things that are blocking us, those are three major things. The first one is the signaling, the encryption. The second one would be that SMS over IP is not supported yet. So as I mentioned a little bit earlier, when you do VoLTE international roaming, make sure you move your SMS over IP to be able to use that as you do VoLTE roam. And the third point is mostly because some of our partners have launched VoLTE roaming, but not all of their customers are VoLTE customers. So there's a little hesitation here on saying some of my customers will not be able to attach to VoLTE while others are VoLTE capable. So there's some steering of roaming operations and things going on to try to say, I can send you my VoLTE customers, but not my 2G, 3G customers. So that still remains kind of a little pain point for us to launch inbound for VoLTE roaming. So I would say that those are the three major points on our side.
We appreciate you sharing that, Luke, and for the comments on the session today. So thank you so much for that. Mihaela, keen to get your thoughts as well.
Yeah, depending on where the operators are based, they may want to first understand their legal obligations to Luke's point about the LI complexity, as a home network, you need to have the capability to turn on, to turn off encryption to support the visit network to fulfill their legal obligations, right? And also as a VCT network, you need to understand how you need to fulfill the legal obligations in the country where you operate. Are you going to fulfill them the same as you do today for voice services, or the same as data? So, excuse me. So with all this, you can decide, you can define what do you need to develop, to deploy in your network to be able to launch VoLTE roaming. The second aspect is the billing. You need to take a decision around how do you want to, what type of charging model you want to adopt, because that could drive also additional cost with the billing upgrades. Of course, you can check with your DCH how they can support you in enabling VoLTE roaming according to your charging, with your preferred charging model. The VoLTE device penetration is a very important aspect, and of course, when we started to look at VoLTE in Vodafone, the situation was very different to what we have today. I think most of the device providers are enabling VoLTE roaming by default nowadays. However, there are still customers using legacy devices, and you need to have steering capability in place to make a distinction between how you steer VoLTE-enabled devices versus 2G, 3G, or legacy devices. So this would be the key pain points in relation to launching VoLTE roaming.
Thank you again, Mahela, for sharing that and for your thoughts as well. Really, really appreciated your inputs. Lovely. And Krista, let's finish with getting your thoughts on this as well.
Yes, and I'll stick to the testing side of it as well. I mean, we identified on our side, it made sense to have a team just dedicated to VoLTE testing, just because of the differences with the different testing scenarios. Being able to have the expertise to be able to do troubleshooting. It's one thing to start the test, but you really want to get in there to help accelerate these launches for the roaming partners. So definitely just having a plan in place all the way starting from the roaming agreement facilitation and getting those prioritizations with the customer, your target list, and being able to go in there and get as many launches as you can before the backup begins, where all the operators want to launch VoLTE.
Right, precisely, and I think that's a key point as well. So, no, thank you for that. Now, we have had a few questions come in. We are at the top of the hour, so we're going to have to answer them offline. Michelle quickly came in and asked probably the most common question we ever get on a webinar, which is, will I get a copy of these slides and the presentation? Michelle, yes, but you'll get better than that as well. You will get a copy of the main white paper that's coming to you either later today or tomorrow morning. You'll receive a link to that, which has all the survey findings plus additional analysis. So that's coming your way. Important, I think, to mention as well the questions that we got from Michael and Carla. They're probably very common questions. So Michael asked, you mentioned the small number of agreements. We discussed this earlier. How can this be accelerated? How can we speed up our VoLTE roaming availability? So Michael, we will follow up with you on that, and I'll ensure the panel speakers get some input on that as well. And Carla asked about how can we learn more about how to launch VoLTE roaming? We've just launched our first set of 4G roaming agreements, and I think there's looking for guidance there. So I think these are very common questions. I think underlying what we've discussed today and the questions that are coming in is the fact that this is still an ongoing topic that's evolving. We're making progress as an industry, which is fantastic, but there's still challenges that we're facing. So to that end, and when you receive the white paper, if there are further questions or even support that you have, or just want to be in contact with your peers about it, please do get in touch, because I know I can speak, on behalf of everyone on this panel today, that we'd be, more than happy to share thoughts and ideas, and experiences with you to help with your own VoLTE roaming launches as well. So on that note, we've reached the hour, so we're going to draw our session to a close. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Panelists, speakers, thank you guys so much as well. It's been really good to have you and listen to your thoughts on this as well. And until next time, we wish you all well, and we look forward to being in touch soon. Okay, take care, and bye-bye.
For having us. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.